My phone had decided to play dead about half an hour ago, leaving me to navigate these back roads with nothing but Uncle Silas's scribbled directions and a growing dread that I'd made a colossal mistake. The gravel spit and crunched under the tires of my beat up sedan as I followed what barely counted as a driveway, weaving past ancient pines that seemed to lean in, whispering secrets and trying to swallow the path whole. 3 hours of driving through the forgotten corners of rural Maine had brought me here, to a place I never in a million years thought I'd see. Just last spring, I was grinding away at a tech startup in Boston, juggling deadlines and complaining about the office coffee. Now, unemployed, practically broke, and about to shack up in a house owned by a great uncle I'd met maybe twice in my life, both times at family funerals I barely remembered. The property just appeared from the shadows of the woods, like something ripped straight from a dusty, old Gothic novel. The 2-story house was a faded gray, its paint peeling in long, ghostly strips that shivered in the breeze. Shutters hung by a thread, and the wrap-around porch sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. Wild rose bushes and thorny vines had launched an all-out invasion on the lower half of the building, clawing their way up the walls with an aggressive grip that made the whole place look like it was being slowly consumed by the forest that cradled it. I parked near what must have once been a proper walkway, now buried under a thick blanket of forgotten leaves and stubborn weeds. The silence hit me like a physical thing the moment I cut the engine. No city hum, no distant sirens, not even the faint rumble of a passing car. Just the low sigh of wind through branches and the faraway call of some bird I couldn't put a name to. Stepping out of the car felt like crossing a threshold into another dimension. The air here was different, thick with the damp sweetness of pine needles and rich earth, and something else I couldn't quite pinpoint. Something strangely floral, almost sickly sweet, like a bouquet left too long in stagnant water. I wrestled my first box out of the trunk and trudged toward the front door, fumbling in my pocket for the key. The key slid into the lock and turned with surprising ease. I'd braced myself for rust and stubborn resistance, but it clicked open smooth as butter, like Uncle Silas had just oiled it yesterday. The door swung inward with a drawn-out groan that echoed through the hollow house. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight filtering through grimy windows. Every piece of furniture was draped in white sheets, giving the entire place the eerie vibe of a forgotten museum or a giant crypt. The floorboards whined under my boots as I navigated the front hallway, past a steep, creaky staircase, and into what looked like the living room. Everything felt preserved, suspended in time, like Uncle Silas had just stepped out for a minute and would be back any second. I dropped the box onto a sheet, covered sofa, and ventured deeper into the house. The kitchen was small and stuck in a different era, with faded yellow linoleum floors and cabinets that had definitely seen better days, or rather, decades. But it was clean, and more importantly, the faucet actually worked and the lights flipped on. After 2 months of couch, surfing and worrying about bills, even this felt like winning the lottery. That's when I spotted it. A single piece of paper, folded precisely, sitting dead center on the kitchen table, covered in careful, almost artistic handwriting. My name was scrawled across the top in neat block letters, Sarah Jenkins. I picked it up, recognizing the same precise script from the directions he'd mailed me along with the key. The paper felt brittle, slightly yellowed, like it had been sitting there for ages, waiting for me. Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and this place is yours. My apologies for that, not apologies for the inheritance itself, but apologies for what came with it. This isn't like other places. There are certain things you must do if you want to stay safe. I've lived here for 40-odd years, and these directives are the only reason I made it this long. 1, never step foot into the forest after sundown. 2, if you observe any illuminations or hear any vocalizations originating from the woods, disregard them entirely. 3, do not consume any produce cultivated from the grounds. 4, refrain from excavating the garden, irrespective of any perceived sights. 5, should any organic matter from the garden breach the domicile's interior, promptly remove it. 6, ensure all ingress and egress points, doors, and windows are sealed from twilight to dawn. I know this sounds completely out there. I know you're probably thinking I was just a crazy old recluse living out here too long. You're partly right. I was old, and I did live alone. But I wasn't crazy. I was cautious. There's a big difference. Follow these directives, Sarah. Your existence depends on it. Silas. I read the note twice, then slowly put it back down, staring at it blankly. 6 rules for living in a house. Not suggestions or friendly advice, but ironclad instructions, written with the kind of grave seriousness you'd expect from someone penning a final will or a deathbed confession. My first impulse was to snort with laughter. My great-uncle, the hermit, who'd lived isolated in these woods for decades, had left me a list of supernatural safety protocols straight out of some cheesy horror flick. Don't wander in the woods at night. Don't chat with voices from the forest. Don't eat the veggies. It sounded like something cooked up for a campfire ghost story, not a real inheritance. But Silas had been dead serious when he wrote this. Every letter was meticulously formed, every word chosen with deliberate intent. This wasn't the rambling of someone losing their marbles. This was precise, calculated. He'd taken his time with this note, probably rewritten it a dozen times to get it just right. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my jeans pocket. Whatever Silas's reasons for these bizarre rules, I had bigger fish to fry, like the fact that my bank account was hovering precariously close to zero and I literally had nowhere else to go. Like how my old boss made it abundantly clear my references would be less than stellar after I'd questioned his creative expense reports a little too publicly. Like how this isolated house in the middle of nowhere was, quite frankly, my only shelter. So, Silas thought the woods were dangerous after dark. Fine by me. I wasn't planning on midnight strolls anyway, and the garden rules seemed harmless enough. Don't munch on random plants and don't go digging around. Pretty much basic common sense, really. The door locking rule was just good security practice, especially out here where the nearest neighbor was probably a good 10 miles away. I spent the next few hours hauling in boxes and trying to make the place feel less like a mausoleum. I ripped the sheets off the living room furniture, revealing a worn but surprisingly sturdy couch and a coffee table that looked lovingly handmade. The kitchen, despite its age, had everything I needed: an old but functional fridge, a gas stove that sputtered to life on the second try, and enough mismatched dishes and utensils for basic cooking. Upstairs, I found a bedroom with a surprisingly comfortable mattress and a bathroom with hot water that ran rust, colored for a minute before clearing up. By late afternoon, I'd made enough progress to feel like I might actually be able to live here. The house, beneath all the layers of neglect, had good bones, and with a good scrub and some minor repairs, it could actually be comfortable. Not exactly postcard perfect, maybe, but certainly livable. I was arranging my paperback thrillers on a shelf in the living room when something caught my eye through the back windows. The house sat on a slight rise, offering a clear view of the sprawling backyard and the dense woods beyond. Between the house and the tree line stretched what used to be Silas's garden, and calling it overgrown was an understatement. The garden had clearly been meticulously planned and cultivated at some point, but now it looked like nature had completely taken over and decided to go wild. Plants grew in impossible, suffocating tangles. Vines twisted around each other in patterns that almost hurt your eyes to look at too closely, and flowers bloomed in colors that seemed too vibrant, too saturated to be natural. The whole area pulsed with such aggressive growth it looked almost sentient, like I was watching it breathe. Vegetables and herbs mingled with wild, unidentifiable plants, creating a chaotic green labyrinth that stretched almost to the very edge of the woods. Some of the larger plants swayed gently in what little breeze there was, but others seemed to move without any wind at all, as if responding to something I couldn't see or hear. I stood at the window for several long minutes, trying to make sense of the visual cacophony. The garden should have been dead or dormant this late in the season, but everything looked bursting with life, almost aggressively so. It was beautiful in a way that made me subtly uneasy, like staring at something that was trying a little too hard to grab your attention. The longer I watched, the more I noticed small, unsettling details. The way certain plants seemed to cluster around specific spots, forming crude circles or lines. The way the colors subtly shifted and deepened when clouds drifted over the sun. The way the entire garden seemed to pulse with a low, rhythmic thrum that, ridiculously, reminded me of a heartbeat. I shook my head, trying to clear it, and stepped away from the window. 2 days of non-stop stress and uncertainty were clearly making me hallucinate. It was just an overgrown garden, neglected by an old man who'd lived alone far too long. The weird colors were probably just some rare, unfamiliar plant varieties, and the movement was just wind and my exhausted eyes playing tricks on me. But as I walked back to my half-unpacked boxes, I found myself glancing toward the back windows again and again, drawn by the hypnotic, unsettling rhythm of that impossible garden pulsing just beyond the glass. My hands were shaky from too much coffee and too little rest, but I kept pulling volumes from the shelves, checking their spines, and arranging them by subject. Silas had been a serious reader: mysteries, science fiction, local history, and what looked like several decades worth of gardening guides that I definitely wasn't planning to consult. The scratching started around 300 in the afternoon. At first, I thought it was just another creak or groan from the old house settling, but this was different. Deliberate, rhythmic, coming from the direction of the back door, I set down the old Agatha Christie novel I'd been holding and listened more carefully. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Something was working at the door itself, not just brushing against it. The sound had a purposeful quality that made my exhausted brain snap to attention. I walked toward the kitchen, moving slowly, trying to stay quiet despite the groaning floorboards. Through the back window, I saw them. 3 small figures crouched at the door, roughly the size of children, but wrong in every possible way. Their skin looked like bark, not smooth like a tree trunk, but rough and ridged like the twisted surface of an old oak. Where their eyes should have been were hollow sockets filled with a soft, sickly green glow that pulsed like the moss was alive and breathing. Their limbs bent at angles that made my stomach turn, arms that curved backward at the elbows, legs that twisted sideways at the knees, fingers that extended too long and split into root, like tendrils instead of ending in normal human digits. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like marionettes being controlled by someone who didn't quite understand how joints were supposed to work. But their faces were the worst part. Vaguely human in shape, I could see the basic structure of a nose, cheekbones, a chin but stretched and distorted like clay that had been molded by someone who'd only heard humans described secondhand. Their mouths opened far wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of sharp brown points that looked more like thorns than teeth. One of the creatures was using its root, fingers to work at the door lock, probing and scraping with a patience that suggested it had done this before. The other 2 had moved to the windows on either side of the door, pressing their faces against the glass and leaving muddy smears that carried the overwhelming smell of rotting vegetation even through the sealed windows. I backed away from the kitchen, my heart hammering as I processed what I was seeing. These weren't just supernatural manifestations like the voice or the light. These were physical beings, solid enough to leave marks on the glass, determined enough to actually attempt breaking into the house. Silas's 5th rule echoed in my memory: should any organic matter from the garden breach the domicile's interior, promptly remove it. The implication had been clear: garden things would try to get inside. I'd thought it was about plants growing through cracks, or maybe insects. I hadn't imagined it meant creatures like these beings, that looked like they'd crawled out of some nightmare fusion of human remains and twisted vegetation. I moved through the house quickly, checking every door and window to make sure everything was locked. The front door, the side door that led to what used to be Silas's workshop, every window on the ground floor, all secure. The creatures outside seemed to sense my movement, and their chittering grew louder, a sound like insects mixed with human whispers that made my skin crawl. From the living room, I could still hear them working at the back of the house. The scratching became more intense, joined by a soft tapping that suggested they were testing different parts of the door and windows, looking for weak points. Occasionally, I heard a wet sliding sound that I didn't want to think about too closely. I found myself pacing between rooms, checking and re-checking the locks, peering through front windows to see if more of those things were approaching from other directions. The house felt smaller with them outside, like the walls were closing in, while simultaneously being my only protection against whatever those creatures intended to do if they got inside. The chittering was the worst part. It had an almost conversational quality, like they were discussing strategy or sharing information about the house's defenses. Sometimes the sounds almost resolved into words not quite, but close enough to make me strain to understand what they might be saying. Other times they dissolved into pure insect noise, clicks and buzzes that seemed to come from deep in their throats. After an hour, I heard new sounds, scraping against the siding like they were trying to climb the exterior walls. I went upstairs and checked the bedroom windows, making sure they were latched, but I couldn't see the creatures from that angle. They were directly below, working their way around the foundation of the house with the methodical thoroughness of professionals. The muddy prints they left on the glass grew thicker as the afternoon wore on, creating patterns that looked almost like writing in some alien script. The smell of rot grew stronger too, seeping through gaps around the window frames and filling the kitchen with the stench of things that had been buried too long and were now walking around in daylight. I tried reading to distract myself, but the constant sounds made concentration impossible. The creatures never stopped moving, never paused to rest, never seemed to get frustrated by their lack of progress. They approached the task of breaking into Silas's house with the same patient persistence I'd seen in the garden's growth patterns, relentless, organic, unstoppable. Around 5:00 p.m., one of them managed to work something loose. I heard a small metallic ping from the back door, followed by excited chittering from all three creatures. My exhausted nerves snapped, and I found myself in the kitchen before I'd consciously decided to move, staring through the window at the things clustered around my only exit. The one at the door had its root, fingers deep in the lock mechanism, twisting and probing with movements that looked more like surgery than simple lock-picking. Dark fluid was leaking from where its fingers disappeared into the metal, staining the door frame with something that looked like tree sap mixed with blood. That's when I noticed their faces more clearly. The bark, skin wasn't uniform. There were patches where I could see something pale underneath, something that looked disturbingly like human flesh, and their hollow eye sockets weren't completely empty. Deep in the green glow, I caught glimpses of what might have been actual eyes. Human eyes staring out from whatever these things had become. I pressed myself against the kitchen wall as far from the windows as possible and focused on Silas's words. The house had protected him for 40 years. The locks had held. The rules had worked. These creatures were testing the defenses, but they hadn't broken through yet. And if I followed the same precautions that had kept Silas safe, they wouldn't break through now. The thought helped steady my nerves, but it also raised new questions. How often had Silas dealt with this? Had he spent decades listening to these things scratch at his doors and windows, knowing that one loose latch or forgotten lock could mean the difference between safety and whatever fate awaited people who let garden creatures inside their homes? The scratching continued for another hour, accompanied by increasingly frustrated chittering. The creatures moved around the house in a systematic pattern, testing every possible entry point with the thoroughness of experts. But as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening, their sounds gradually changed from determined to resigned. By the time the sun dipped below the tops of the trees, they were retreating. I watched through the front window as all three creatures emerged from around the sides of the house, moving with the same jerky, unnatural gait they'd used when approaching. They didn't look back at the house or make any threatening gestures. They simply walked across Silas's overgrown lawn toward the garden, their bark like skin blending seamlessly with the twisted plants until I couldn't tell where the creatures ended and the vegetation began. The garden seemed to welcome them back. Vines parted to create pathways. Flowers turned to track their movement, and the chaotic tangle of growth shifted and rearranged itself to accommodate their return. Within minutes, they disappeared completely, absorbed back into the green maze that had probably created them in the first place. I spent the rest of the evening checking and re-checking every lock in the house, my hands still shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The muddy prints they'd left on the back windows were already drying, but the smell of rotting vegetation lingered in the kitchen like a chilling reminder of how close they'd come to finding a way inside. Silas's rules weren't just survival instructions. They were battle plans developed through decades of defending this house against forces that wanted very badly to get inside, forces that were patient, intelligent, and absolutely determined to claim whatever they'd been seeking for all these years. I was beginning to understand that my great-uncle hadn't been a hermit by choice. He'd been a soldier, holding his ground against an enemy that never stopped attacking and never stopped evolving new ways to breach his defenses. Now, that enemy knew someone new was living in the house, and based on what I'd seen that afternoon, they were very interested in meeting me. A grim discovery I'd managed maybe 2 hours of actual sleep before the morning sun dragged me back to consciousness. My eyes felt gritty and my head pounded from too much coffee and too little rest, but something had woken me up that wasn't the usual house sounds or my own anxious thoughts. The garden looked different. I could see it from my bedroom window upstairs, and even from that distance, something was clearly wrong. New shapes interrupted the chaotic tangle of growth, dark patches that hadn't been there when those creatures retreated yesterday evening. Rectangular patches that looked like fresh soil had been turned and mounded. I sat on the edge of Silas's bed, squinting through the grimy glass and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The morning light wasn't strong enough yet to reveal details, but there were definitely new disturbances scattered throughout the garden. 7 or 8 spots where the earth looked darker, higher, arranged in patterns that made my stomach clench with recognition. They looked like graves. I told myself I was being paranoid. The creatures had probably just damaged some plants while moving through the garden, leaving behind torn soil and trampled vegetation. Or maybe some larger animal had been digging for food. There were probably dozens of logical explanations that didn't involve anything supernatural or horrifying. But Silas's rules kept echoing in my head, particularly the ones about the garden. Never consume anything harvested from the grounds. Refrain from excavating the garden, irrespective of any perceived sights. Should any organic matter from the garden breach the domicile's interior, promptly remove it. Rules that suggested the garden itself was dangerous, not just the creatures that lived in it. I made coffee with hands that shook more than I wanted to admit, then spent an hour trying to distract myself with Silas's books and yesterday's leftover dinner. But the rectangular patches of disturbed soil kept pulling my attention back to the kitchen window. Every time I glanced outside, they seemed more obvious, more deliberately arranged. By 900 a.m., I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. I knew it was stupid. Every instinct Silas had tried to give me said to stay inside, lock the doors, and pretend the garden didn't exist. But I needed to know what had changed overnight. Needed to understand what those creatures had been doing when they returned to their twisted habitat. I found a pair of Silas's work boots by the back door and laced them tight over my socks. The leather was cracked and stained with what looked like years of garden soil, but they fit well enough. I checked the door lock 3 times before opening it, making sure I could get back inside quickly if needed. The smell hit me immediately, not just the rotting vegetation I'd grown used to, but something deeper and more organic, something that made me breathe through my mouth and fight the urge to gag. The morning air was thick with it, sweet and putrid, like flowers left in water for too long, mixed with meat that had gone bad. A stone path led from the back door toward the garden's edge, barely visible under years of moss and creeping vines. I followed it carefully, keeping my steps light and my eyes on the disturbed patches of soil that looked even more ominous from ground level. The first one was maybe 20 feet from where the path ended, a rough rectangle of dark earth, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, mounded higher than the surrounding soil, like something had been recently buried there. But as I got closer, I realized the earth wasn't staying still. The soil was shifting, moving, settling and rising like something underneath was trying to push its way to the surface. I took another step closer, my boots squelching in ground that was softer and damper than it should have been after days of clear weather. The mounded earth continued its slow, rhythmic movement, and I caught a glimpse of something pale poking through the dark soil. Fabric rotted and stained, but definitely fabric. My stomach lurched as I understood what I was looking at. This wasn't just disturbed earth. It was a grave, a shallow grave that was slowly exposing its contents as the ground rejected whatever had been buried there. I forced myself to look around the garden more carefully, counting the rectangular patches I'd seen from upstairs. 7 of them. 7 graves scattered throughout Silas's overgrown garden, each one in the process of revealing what lay beneath the soil. The plants growing around the graves were different from the chaotic tangle I'd observed before. These were focused, purposeful, clustered around each burial site like they were feeding on what lay rotting underneath. Thick vines pulsed with visible fluid flowing through them, their surfaces slick and organic. Flowers opened and closed with a rhythm that looked disturbingly like breathing, petals wet and glistening in the morning light. I moved closer to the nearest grave, staying on the stone path, but leaning forward to get a better look. The pale fabric was part of a shirt or dress, so degraded by time and moisture that I couldn't tell which. But there was more than just clothing visible now. The shifting soil had exposed what looked like the curve of a rib cage, yellowed bone that gleamed wetly in the dappled sunlight. A sound escaped my throat, part gasp, part sob, as I realized I was staring at human remains. Not recent remains, but old ones, buried here years or maybe decades ago, and now being slowly uncovered by earth that seemed to have a will of its own. I backed away from the grave, but my eyes kept moving to the others scattered throughout the garden. Each one showed similar signs of exposure, glimpses of bone, scraps of rotted clothing, the unmistakable shapes of human skulls pushing through the dark soil. The plants around each burial site grew thicker and more aggressive, their roots probably intertwined with whatever lay decomposing in the ground. This wasn't just a garden. It was an active burial ground, fed by human remains and tended by creatures that had once been human themselves. The things that had tried to break into the house yesterday weren't just supernatural manifestations. They were what happened to people who ended up buried in Silas's garden. The understanding hit me like a physical blow. My great-uncle hadn't been protecting me from abstract, supernatural dangers. He'd been keeping me away from a place where people were murdered and buried, where their remains fed the soil that created new horrors to hunt for fresh victims. The sweet, putrid smell grew stronger as the morning sun warmed the garden. Flies buzzed around the exposed graves, a cloud so thick they looked like smoke rising from the earth. The pulsing vines grew more agitated, their fluid-filled tubes beating faster like excited heartbeats. I turned and ran back toward the house, my feet slipping on the moss-covered stones as I fought to reach the safety of Silas's locked doors. Behind me, the garden seemed to sense my retreat, and the sounds it made changed from the usual organic rustling to something that sounded almost like disappointed sighs. I slammed the back door and turned the deadbolt with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Through the kitchen window, I could see the graves continuing their slow exposure, revealing more bone and rotted fabric with each passing minute. The plants around them swayed without any wind, their breathing. Flowers opening wider, as if they were hungry for whatever was decomposing beneath the soil. Silas's rules weren't just about avoiding supernatural forces. They were survival instructions for living next to a mass grave, a place where something had been systematically killing and burying people for years. The garden wasn't just alive. It was fed by death, sustained by human remains, and actively working to add new bodies to its collection. I sat at the kitchen table with my back to the window, finally understanding the true scope of what my great-uncle had been protecting me from. This property didn't just have supernatural dangers. It held secrets that were very real, very physical, and absolutely horrifying. 7 bodies, at least 7 people buried in that garden, slowly being exposed by earth that wanted to show me what it contained. 7 families somewhere who had probably never learned what happened to their missing loved ones. And I was living alone in a house that overlooked their graves, with nothing but Silas's rules standing between me and whatever had put them there. I couldn't stay here another hour. The realization hit me with absolute clarity as I sat at Silas's kitchen table, my back turned to those graves shifting and settling in the morning light. My financial problems were real, but they were problems I could solve. Getting another job might take months. Burning through my savings might leave me broke, but those were normal human difficulties. What I discovered in that garden was something else entirely. I started with the bedroom, throwing my clothes back into the same duffel bag I'd unpacked just days ago. My hands moved automatically, folding shirts and rolling jeans while my mind processed what I'd seen. Silas's note made complete sense now. Those rules weren't paranoid ramblings. They were survival instructions for living next to a killing ground. My great-uncle had spent 40 years following them, because the alternative was ending up buried in that garden, becoming fertilizer for whatever unholy ecosystem had taken root on this property. I moved through the house methodically, collecting my books from Silas's shelves and packing my few kitchen items back into cardboard boxes. The silence felt different now, charged with new meaning. Every creak and groan of the old house sounded like a warning, urging me to hurry before something decided I'd seen too much to be allowed to leave. The thought made me pack faster. I had no idea what rules governed this place, what invisible boundaries I might have crossed by discovering those graves. Silas's instructions were about staying safe while living here, but they didn't cover what happened when someone decided to run. My laptop and chargers went into my messenger bag, along with the few papers I'd brought. I left Silas's furniture and appliances exactly where I'd found them, taking only what I'd arrived with. The house could keep its secrets and its inherited horrors. I wanted no connection to this place that couldn't be severed by simply driving away. The worst part was loading my car. Each trip from the house to my Honda required walking past the kitchen window, where I could see the garden continuing its grotesque revelation. More bones were visible now, scattered among the plants like decorations. The rectangular patches of disturbed earth had grown larger, exposing rib cages and femurs, and what looked like a complete human skull grinning up through the dark soil. I kept my eyes focused on my car trunk, cramming boxes and bags into every available space. The Honda wasn't built for moving, but I managed to fit everything by shoving my duffel bag into the back seat and balancing my laptop case on top of a box of books. As I carried the last bag, my toiletries, and the few groceries I'd bought from the house to the car, I noticed movement in the garden. Movement. They were emerging in broad daylight. The same creatures that had tested Silas's locks and windows yesterday were rising from the twisted vegetation, but the afternoon sun revealed them in horrible detail. What I'd taken for bark, like skin, was actually a mixture of plant matter and human remains fused together in ways that made my stomach clench. Bone was visible through gaps in their vegetative covering, pale ribs poking through moss and vines, finger bones extending from root like hands, skulls partially hidden by clusters of leaves and small flowers. Their hair was the worst part. Human hair recognizable in color and texture, but intertwined with trailing vines and patches of moss that grew directly from their scalps. Some of them had strands of brown or blonde or gray hanging down their backs, moving with an organic rhythm that had nothing to do with wind. They moved with that same jerky, unnatural gait I'd seen before. But now I understood why. These weren't just supernatural beings. They were human corpses, transformed by whatever force controlled the garden, animated by roots and vines that had grown through their bones and nervous systems, walking dead, powered by plant matter, held together by vegetation that fed on their decomposing remains. I threw the last bag into my car and slammed the trunk, my hand shaking as I fumbled for my keys. More creatures were emerging from different parts of the garden, dozens of them moving toward the house with a purpose that suggested they knew I was leaving. I started the Honda and put it in reverse, backing quickly away from the house as the first of them reached Silas's overgrown lawn. In my side mirror, I could see them spreading out around the property's perimeter, positioning themselves like they were preparing to reclaim territory I'd temporarily occupied. The driveway felt longer than it had when I'd arrived. Every bump and pothole jarred my already frayed nerves as I accelerated down the dirt road, gravel spraying behind my tires. I kept glancing in my rear view mirror, watching the house shrink in the distance while more creatures emerged from the garden to join their companions. By the time I reached the first curve in the driveway, they were piling against Silas's windows and doors, not trying to break in like they had yesterday, but pressing themselves against the glass and wood like they were trying to get inside now that the house was empty. Their movements had changed from predatory to possessive, like they were reclaiming something that belonged to them. The garden itself looked different, too, breathing with new energy that made the chaotic tangle of growth pulse and shift in ways that hurt to watch directly. Whatever I'd awakened by discovering those graves had spread through the entire ecosystem, energizing the plants and creatures with a vitality that seemed to feed on my departure. I took the final curve before the main road and lost sight of the house, but I could feel it behind me. That entire twisted landscape breathing and moving with renewed purpose. The Honda's engine strained as I pushed it faster than was safe on the narrow dirt road, desperate to reach pavement and the normal world beyond Silas's property line. When I finally reached the intersection with the county road, I stopped and looked back one last time. The trees blocked my view of the house and garden, but I could see dark shapes moving through the branches. More creatures probably spreading through the woods or returning to whatever lair they used when they weren't testing Silas's defenses. The property would continue claiming victims. Someone else would eventually inherit it, or developers would buy it, or hikers would stumble across it. Normal people who didn't have Silas's note, who wouldn't understand the rules or recognize the dangers until it was too late. The garden would keep growing. The creatures would keep hunting, and more graves would appear among the twisted plants. I turned onto the county road and drove toward town, already planning to never speak of what I'd witnessed. Who would believe me? And even if someone did, what could be done? Call the police and tell them about walking corpses and supernatural gardens. Report the graves and watch investigators disappear into the same ecosystem that had created them. Silas had been the guardian of something that should never have existed. And now that guardian was gone. I was driving away from a horror that would continue unchecked. But I was also driving toward a future where I might actually survive to see next week. My financial problems felt manageable now. Unemployment and debt were human-sized difficulties that could be solved with persistence and time. What I'd left behind in that garden was something else entirely. An ancient evil that had taken root in Maine soil and would keep feeding until someone found a way to stop it. But that someone wouldn't be me. I was just grateful to be alive and driving away, with Harold's Honda carrying me toward whatever normal life I could still salvage from the wreckage of the past few days. I turned onto the county road and drove toward town, already planning to never speak of what I'd witnessed. Who would believe me? And even if someone did, what could be done? Call the police and tell them about walking corpses and supernatural gardens. Report the graves and watch investigators disappear into the same ecosystem that had created them. Silas had been the guardian of something that should never have existed. And now that guardian was gone. I was driving away from a horror that would continue unchecked. But I was also driving toward a future where I might actually survive to see next week. My financial problems felt manageable now. Unemployment and debt were human-sized difficulties that could be solved with persistence and time. What I'd left behind in that garden was something else entirely. An ancient evil that had taken root in Maine soil and would keep feeding until someone found a way to stop it. But that someone wouldn't be me. I was just grateful to be alive and driving away, with my Honda carrying me toward whatever normal life I could still salvage from the wreckage of the past few days. The aftermath, the first few days, were a blur of cheap motel rooms, too much coffee, and the constant, knowing fear that something might have followed me. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long, every creak of the motel floorboards sounded like footsteps, and the scent of damp earth and something sickly sweet seemed to cling to my clothes, no matter how many times I washed them. I couldn't shake the image of those twisted figures, their human features barely visible beneath layers of bark and vine, their eyes glowing with that eerie, moss-green light, and the garden the shifting, breathing, ravenous garden with its grim harvest. I called an old college friend, Lisa, in Portland. She was an angel, didn't ask too many questions when I mumbled something about a terrible inherited property and needing a change of scenery ASAP. She offered her spare room without hesitation, sleeping on a proper bed in a city apartment with the mundane sounds of traffic outside my window instead of the unnerving symphony of Silas's house felt like a miracle. But the nightmares started almost immediately. In my dreams, the blue light pulsed, not with beauty, but with a malevolent lure, drawing me deeper into a forest where the trees whispered my mother's name. I'd see the garden, lush and vibrant, but instead of flowers, human faces bloomed from the soil, their eyes wide and pleading. The bark-skinned creatures would claw at the windows, their chittering echoing the lost voices of the buried. Trying to pull me into their grotesque embrace, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart hammering, reaching for a phone that wasn't there, a gun I didn't own, anything to fight off the lingering terror. During the day, I tried to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. I started applying for jobs again, any job, even entry-level admin work. The financial stress, which had once felt insurmountable, now seemed trivial compared to the horrors I'd fled. It was just money. Money I could earn back, my former bosses, less than glowing. References felt like a distant, petty squabble. I'd faced something far worse than a bad performance review. I deliberately avoided news from rural Maine, especially anything about property sales or strange disappearances. Ignorance, in this case, felt like a vital shield. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the property would continue its dark cycle. Someone else would eventually stumble upon it, drawn by the promise of cheap land or a quiet life. Another well-meaning hare, another unsuspecting nature lover. They wouldn't have Silas's cryptic note, or the chilling experience of the voice and the light, or the horrifying sight of the garden's true nature. They wouldn't know the rules until it was far, far too late. The knowledge was a heavy burden, a secret I carried deep inside, festering and silent. How do you tell someone about a garden that grows people? About corpses that walk and whisper your name? You don't. Not if you want to be believed, not if you want to retain any shred of sanity in the eyes of the world. So I kept it locked away, a private horror that shaped my every decision. I found myself instinctively checking locks, even in Lisa's secure apartment building. I started avoiding parks with dense foliage, and the scent of certain flowers could send a shiver down my spine. The world, once a place of mundane concerns, was now layered with a hidden, ancient dread. Sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet and my nightmares faded just enough for me to think, I wondered about Silas. 40 years. 40 years he had lived with that. He wasn't crazy, he was a sentry, a lonely, vigilant guardian against an insidious evil. He had held the line, night after night, resisting temptations designed to break the strongest will, enduring the constant presence of something unspeakable just beyond his doorstep. What did he do when the voice called for his loved ones? Did he ever almost break? Did he ever truly feel safe, even within those locked walls? I realized then that my escape wasn't an ending. It was simply a transfer of knowledge, a passing of the torch of vigilance. I was no longer guarding that house, but I was now eternally aware of the kind of evil that could root itself in the earth, feed on human tragedy and thrive unseen. I was alive, yes, but the experience had carved something deep into my soul, a permanent scar. I had survived, but I was irrevocably changed. The world was no longer just the world. It was a thin veneer over something dark and hungry. And for the rest of my life, I would be careful, just like Silas.